closure of my talk on National Patient Safety Implementation Framework, I'll move on to the next talk. Next talk, which has been, as I have told you, as I have foretold you, that this year's theme is safe maternal and newborn care. And the slogan the WHO has propounded or proffered is act now for safe and respectable childbirth. That's why we have roped in three experts from three domains, one from pediatric surgery, other from neonatology, and third from maternal and reproductive health. So in the line in the league, we have first with us Professor Richa Lal, who has been with us until very recently as head of the Department of Pediatric Surgery at SDPGIMS, and she has been a pediatric surgeon par excellence and a human being worth learning every moment. I have seen her from close quarters, and man has kindly consented to be with us and share her views on how a clinician would look at from the perspective of patient safety while doing clinical risk assessment with special reference to surgery. Over to Professor Richa, ma'am.
So, good evening, seniors and friends, and thank you so much, Professor Harshvardhan, for those kind words of introduction. The stage has been set so beautifully by all my previous speakers, Professor Dhiman, Professor Agarwal, and Professor Harshvardhan. And over the next 20 minutes, I will share my views on clinical risk assessment and management with special reference to a surgical patient. So, okay, so I hope my screen is nicely visible and I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am. Perfectly visible and clearly audible.
Okay, thank you. So this is the outline of my presentation. Why are risk assessment and management processes important? What are the components of a risk assessment and management process? That is, factors related to the healthcare system, the healthcare professional, and the patient. Key steps of risk assessment process, which starts with incident reporting. Then what is a near miss incident? What is a never incident or a catastrophic incident? The role of documentation and audit. Key steps of risk management process, that is designing safe systems of care, systems to reduce adverse events, and systems to improve human performance, with a note on mentoring, good communication, and addressing human factors, fatigue, and sleep deprivation. And then I will zoom down on surgical risk assessment, that is factors related to preoperative patient physiology and complexity of surgery, and surgical risk management, wherein I will present the components of the universal WHO surgical safety checklist, and also a checklist which needs to be tailored to every patient and the procedure. So why do we need to assess clinical risk? Because identifying risk factors helps us to optimize and take preemptive corrective measures targeted at pre-intervention patient physiology, the anticipated critical steps during the intervention, thereby ensuring a safe post-intervention course. And all this translates into an improved patient outcome and enhanced patient satisfaction. It also helps in triaging the utilization of critical care resources. That is, which patient is likely to warrant and benefit most from ICU care, because critical care resources are precious and cost-intensive everywhere. It also helps in appropriate patient counseling and taking informed consent, which helps in minimizing risk of litigations. Because adverse events resulting in most complaints and litigations are related to post-intervention complications, deaths, unnecessary interventions, injuries related to equipment malfunction, retained foreign bodies, and surgery-related infections, especially orthopedic implants. Then reducing preventable adverse events also reduce the burden of unanticipated cost for the patient, and they allow a judicious utilization of precious healthcare resources like an ICU bed or a ventilator or blood products. So then what are the components of a risk assessment and management process? Who are the key players? There are risk factors related to the healthcare system, the healthcare professional, and the patient, and I will begin by addressing the first two first. So as a first step to risk assessment, one has to identify risk and assess the severity and frequency of risk, which we also call as triaging risk. And as an example, failure to observe appropriate hand hygiene before handling a CVP catheter is a relatively low risk adverse event as compared to a mismatched blood transfusion. Step 3 is incident reporting. So what is an incident? It is an event or circumstance that could have or did lead to unintended and or unnecessary harm to a person and or a complaint, loss or damage. So the type of issues that have been identified by incident monitoring by WHO data as per order of frequency have been falls, injuries other than falls like burns and pressure injuries, medication errors like overdose, wrong route or wrong medication, clinical process problems like wrong diagnosis and wrong treatment, equipment problems, documentation problems, hazardous environment like inadequate sterilization of OT equipment, which can lead to a spurt of surgical site infections, inadequate resources, infusion problems like a 3 kg baby receiving 250 ml fluid over a period of 10 minutes and landing into fluid overload, infrastructure problems like insufficient beds, power failure, or hospital fires, which are a big disaster. Nutrition problems like a patient who's prepared for general anesthesia gets fed, predisposing to risk of aspiration. Then problems related to blood and blood products like mismatched or too rapid an infusion or even storage problems, and oxygen problems like failure of supply or premature stoppage. So what then is a near miss or a near hit incident? It is an action that may have caused an adverse event, but corrective event was taken just in time, or the patient did not suffer adverse reaction to the incorrect treatment, thankfully. And I will cite a real life example from my own experience that after a prolonged abdominal surgery, which was a hepatectomy, the surgical team starts closing the abdomen. While applying skin sutures, the floor nurse suddenly reports that a gauze piece is missing. So everybody pauses, the abdomen is reopened and the missing gauze piece is found deep into the right subhepatic space. So an adverse event was prevented because a floor nurse insisted that the surgical team reopens the abdomen. At the other end of the spectrum is a never event or a catastrophic event, which is an event that should never be allowed to happen because of potential for death or significant harm. Example, an inadvertent left-sided nephrectomy in a patient with non-functioning right kidney, and one can imagine the unforgivable consequences of this kind of an adverse event or a mismatched blood transfusion. Step 4 is documentation of the adverse event, and to which I would like to emphasize that adequate and clear documentation of every step of a patient's journey to the healthcare system, starting from documentation of patient identity, investigations, diagnosis, pre-intervention instructions, details of treatment, all these go a long way in preventing adverse events and possible complaints and litigations. Step 5 is a regular and an honest audit with an aim to report, document, perform a root cause analysis of adverse events, even targeted approach to rectify. And it is important to emphasize that the basic principles of patient safety is to set systems in place, that is checklists, protocols, and care pathways, rather than one which holds an individual responsible. So audit should always be educational rather than attributing blame, because a blame culture is always detrimental. So after having assessed risk, what constitutes a successful risk management program? One is creating and managing safe systems of care. Examples being care bundles like a CVP care bundle or a ventilator associated pneumonia care bundle, and protocols like basic life support or advanced cardiac life support care bundle. And these ensure that every member of the team, starting from a nursing staff to a resident to a consultant, adhere to some uniform essential steps necessary for a safe process or a procedure. Two is systems designed to reduce adverse events, examples of which are a patient identification band or WHO's Universal Surgical Safety Checklist. Three is systems designed to improve human performance. So what then are the factors in a system which have an influence on human performance? Well-functioning teams report lesser adverse events, and some of the fundamental principles of well-functioning teams are appropriate supervision and mentoring, and adequate and clear communication. Now, everybody in the amongst my previous speakers have repeated that statement: to err is human, which means that mishaps will occur in every healthcare professional's career at some point of time, but availability of help at the right time can be life-saving. So well-functioning teams ensure that a team member can ask help if necessary. Say if there is an unexpected bleed or an inadvertent injury to any vital structure, like a bile duct or a ureter. Then in today's era of highly complex multidisciplinary care, good communication is very vital to decrease complications. So within the healthcare team, starting from the nursing staff to the resident doctor, to the consultant in charge, and allied specialists like anesthesia, radiology, intensive care, etc., etc., it is imperative on the same wavelength. Good communication with the patient is equally vital. Consent needs to be informed. And if we can communicate with the patient and the family with honesty and empathy, especially in case of any adverse event, it will go a long way in minimizing complaints and litigations. The other human factors which are important but are infrequently discussed are fatigue and sleep deprivation. A greater risk of adverse events have been reported during changeover of shifts, during night shifts, and in a system where there is a system of 24-hour duties versus shift duties. And it is worth noting that sleep deprivation of even one night impairs alertness and reflexes to a level which is equivalent to blood alcohol levels, which would prohibit safe driving. And we in healthcare system are dealing with human lives day in and day out. So with this background, I will zoom on into risk assessment and management related to the surgical patient. I'm sure the obstetricians in the audience will be able to relate to it. And I'm also very sure that the physicians will be able to relate because they make a very useful contribution to the pre-op and the post-op care of a surgical patient. So if you reflect on a surgical patient's journey through the hospital, the exposure to risk is not only during the surgical procedure, but also during numerous processes and procedures before, during, and after surgery. That is perioperative radiological investigations, any endoscopies if warranted, transfusion of blood and blood products, and n number of medications that this patient is going to receive. Again, I will cite a real life example from my own experience. A baby with imperforate anus and a colostomy gets admitted from the OPD for an elective pull-through procedure. Next day, the baby is taken to radiology for a barium contrast study. Barium is injected under pressure. Unfortunately, there is a colonic perforation and barium peritonitis. So that very night, the baby has to be taken up for an emergency surgery for barium peritonitis. And the actual elective surgery for which the baby was admitted gets postponed by another 6 months. Now, two broad groups of parameters determine surgical risks. Those related to preoperative patient physiology and associated comorbidities, and those related to the complexity of surgery and the intraoperative events. So what parameters related to preoperative patient physiology determine surgical risk? Extremes of age, newborns, especially preterm and low birth weight, and elderly. Each of them have restricted physiological reserves and are more susceptible to sepsis. Malignancy, with associated issues of poor nutrition, immunosuppression, chemotherapy-related toxicity. Poor nutrition per se, of whatever etiology it may be. Associated organ dysfunction, which may be related to the primary surgical diagnosis. Example, a patient with chronic liver disease who warrants surgery for portal hypertensive bleed, wherein the surgical outcome would depend on the underlying liver reserve as well. It may be unrelated, but incidentally associated with the primary surgical diagnosis. Example, a baby with esophageal atresia who also has an associated VSD plus PS, wherein this cardiac anomaly will also affect the post-surgical outcome of esophageal atresia surgery. Immunocompromised state, say post-chemotherapy or prolonged steroid therapy. Example, a lady who has steroid-dependent ITP and needs a hysterectomy. Here, tissue healing is impaired and every suture line, including abdominal closure, is precarious and there is increased risk of sepsis. Now, after these patient-related factors, what determines the complexity of surgery and what are the intraoperative events which affect outcomes adversely? The first of which is the urgency of surgery, which in order of risk has been graded as immediate, wherein the pathology does not permit any window period to resuscitate or optimize. Example for which is a life-threatening torrential bleed or a baby who has aspirated a foreign body and is desaturating. And very often in this kind of a situation, we need to take an informed consent that we may lose the patient on the operating table itself. Then comes urgent, wherein the pathology permits a narrow window period of 4 to 6 hours for basic fluid resuscitation and giving antibiotics, etc. Example, post-endoscopic esophageal perforation with severe mediastinitis. Then expedite, wherein you can stabilize overnight and operate next morning. Example, subacute intestinal obstruction. And then elective. So why do immediate and urgent surgery have greater risk? Because here the pathology does not permit enough time to optimize physiology, or optimization may just not be possible without controlling the source of sepsis or controlling the source of bleed. And very often here, the patient is shifted to the OT with impaired perfusion and oxygenation and deranged metabolism, and all this may culminate into secondary organ dysfunction like chest infection or renal dysfunction, which further complicate the entire outcome. The other factors are duration of surgery and blood loss. And regarding blood loss, the most difficult scenario is one in which there is an inadvertent major vascular injury in what was anticipated to be an uncomplicated elective surgery. Example, an elective laparoscopic cholecystectomy, where there is aortic injury while inserting trocar, or there is a slipped cystic artery clip. So here the team was unprepared. The vascular access was not geared for large volume rapid infusions, and the blood was not arranged. Then the complexity of risk to adjacent vital structures. Example, a large retroperitoneal tumor in close proximity to various branches of the aorta and the IVC. Preoperative surgery, always a challenge because of adhesions and obliteration of normal tissue planes. Difficult abdominal closure leading to abdominal compartment syndrome and cardiorespiratory compromise. Example, surgery for exomphalus or congenital diaphragmatic hernia, wherein the surgeon needs to position Barber loops within a small peritoneal cavity. Now, after assessing surgical risk comes surgical risk management. So Dr. Gaurav was referring to the WHO surgical safety checklist, which needs to be followed universally by all institutions and all surgical disciplines. And I will present the components of this checklist at the end of my presentation. But in actual practice, in addition, checklist needs to be individualized for each patient and every procedure. And checklists are important because they ensure that no important issues are missed out and that everybody in the team is aware of the plan and his or her role. So this is as a patient-centric checklist, this is what we would do. As a first step, confirm diagnosis and if necessary, reconfirm. which means review radiology and review histopathology. Review radiology for site and site of pathology and vital structures which need to be safeguarded. The site is particularly important when removal of an organ is contemplated, like a nephrectomy. Review histopathology, especially when histopathology has been reported as malignancy from another referring center, and when the proposed surgery entails removal of an organ, say a hysterectomy or an esophagectomy, because there is a histopathology diagnosis of a malignancy. Optimize physiology and metabolic profile, that is coagulation, nutrition, which implies not only albumin and hemoglobin, but also things like magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, etc. Actively screen for and treat any lurking foci of sepsis. Immunocompromised patients especially have mucocutaneous fungal infections that can precipitate post-surgical sepsis. Similarly, patients with long-standing indwelling drains and tubes, say within the biliary system or within the urinary system, take cultures to guide the perioperative antibiotic cover. Take preemptive measures to minimize surgical site infections. A simple protocol like ensuring that every patient will receive a good bath on the day prior to surgery and the right time and technique of part preparation go a long way in minimizing surgical site infections. A careful drug history, especially for drugs that may adversely affect intraoperative outcomes and anticoagulants. Prime the anesthetist and decide on the appropriate timing of withholding certain drugs like anticoagulants. For specialized procedures, confirm availability of intraoperative logistics. Adequate blood or blood products, especially if the blood group is rare. Special equipment like energy devices, staplers, intraoperative frozen section, intraoperative ultrasound, whether they are available and whether they are in working order. An ICU bed if post-operative ventilation is anticipated. So this brings us to the WHO surgical safety checklist. It has 3 components. Before induction of anesthesia, which is referred to as sign-in, before skin incision, which is referred to as time out, and before patient leaves operating room, which is referred to as sign out. So at sign in, the patient confirms identity, site, procedure, and consent. The site is marked. The anesthesia safety check has been completed, which means that all anesthesia-related equipment and life-saving drugs are in order. Pulse oximeter on patient and functioning. Confirmation whether the patient has any known allergy, any issues related to airway or aspiration, and whether the risk of estimated blood loss is more than 500 ml in an adult or more than 7 ml per kg in a child, wherein adequate access for blood transfusion should be secured and blood should be made available in the OT. Then before skin incision, all members of the team confirm their identity. The surgeon, the anesthetist, and the nurse confirm patient, site, and procedure. The surgeon quickly reviews any anticipated intraoperative critical events, the anticipated duration of surgery, and anticipated blood loss. The anesthetist also reviews any critical anesthesia-related issues during surgery, and the nursing team reviews status of sterility of the equipment and whether all equipment is in working order. Confirm whether antibiotic prophylaxis has been given in the last 60 minutes and whether essential imaging like CT or MRI or X-rays are displayed in the OR. Then before the patient leaves the operating room, that is at sign out, the nurse verbally confirms that the name of the procedure has been correctly recorded, that the instrument, sponge, and needle count are correct, the specimen has been labeled correctly, and before the patient is wheeled out of the OR, the surgeon and the anesthetist discuss crucial issues related to the post-operative management of the patient. So with that, I sign out. I thank all of you, especially the physicians, for sharing the surgical perspective with me. I thank Professor Harshvardhan for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this webinar on an area which is very close to my heart. And I eagerly look forward to listening to Dr. Anita and Dr. Mandakini. Thank you all for your patient hearing.
It was a pleasure listening to you, ma'am, because I am a trained administrator. And I again slipped to my UG surgery classes while listening to you, Madam, very beautifully, she built the topic as to the basic, very basic background. Then she defined what the patient safety is, what the near miss, and after letting the audience understand the PS terms, the patient safety specific terms, she moved on to why it is important to do a risk assessment or risk stratification prior to surgery. And then she broadly spoke on the elective surgeries vis-a-vis surgery per se. And very beautifully, she tried to make the audience understand, so try to emphasize for the audience that how even elective surgeries can become, like the examples she gave on lap chole and then injury to the aorta and things like that. I hope the entire aim of me as an organizer was to sensitize the audience to help the audience develop another frame of reference while rendering healthcare in whatever capacity as surgeon or as physician or as other stakeholders in the process pathway or healthcare delivery pathway. So I extend my thanks and gratitude to Professor Richa ma'am, our former head Pete surgical gastro, wherein she tried to make you, she took you to journey towards the importance, the specific terms, the stratification, assessment, and how even electives could become challenging at times, and how we want to be prepared before closing on to the surgical safety checklist per se or in detail. Thank you very much, ma'am, for being with us.
Thank you, Rajesh.
Moving ahead.